Resawing. What is resawing anyhow? Resawing is defined as cutting a piece of wood to a preferred dimension that's not available off the shelf from another piece of wood that's thicker, on edge. You want to be cutting it on edge. That's resawing. Okay? And the cut is too deep to make on one pass through the table saw. Huh? That's what resawing is? Yeah, that's what they say. That's what we're going to try to do with the bandsaw in the shop. We have two different types of blades. We have a carbide tip blade, and we have a standard silicone blade like is on this saw right here. And you'll notice the deep gullets that are in the blade, and the gullets are used to keep the kerf of the cut clean. These deep gullets keep the sawdust out of the kerf. The main idea is to keep the blade cool. And the other thing is that the teeth are real coarse, and there's just few teeth to the inch. This particular blade and the carbide tip blade, the same way, it's only got about 2 or 3 teeth to the inch. The carbide blade is going to be installed on the new bandsaw when it arrives. So we haven't taken it out of the box yet, and we're anxious to see how it's going to cut also. Of course, resawing has got to come with some resaw rules. I know how you feel about rules, but got to have some resaw rules. Some of which are no logs, no green wood, and no pressure treated wood, because pressure treated wood is saturated with moisture and gum. The other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to use the resaw to cut wood that can easily be cut on some other type of saw that we have in the shop. It should be used strictly for resawing. When you're cutting against a fence, we have a double feather board that we purchased specifically for resawing. It has 2 feather boards on it. They're perfectly aligned with one another, so you never have to touch these adjustments up here. What you do is you line your piece up where you're going to cut. Once you get it lined up, you put the feather board against your workpiece and you split the difference on the blade. About half of your feather board on the in feed and the other half of the feather board on the out feed. Apply a little pressure and snug up. Just turn these knobs till they stop. You don't want to turn them any further. We're going to talk about feather boards at the end of this demonstration. We have a pile of them we can no longer use. This feather board right here was $100, and the single feather boards are $50 each. Okay, so that's the setup for using your feather board. Now you notice that we aren't using the top feather board at all. That's fine, don't worry about it, because the bottom feather board is holding your workpiece against the fence. Of course, if you had a wider piece that you were resawing, like this one, okay, then you would be using both of the feather boards, top and bottom. They're both perfectly in line with one another, so you just need to just shove it up against there, and you'll know that where this one is touching, the bottom one is also touching. The only adjustments that you should make on the saw is the fence to the blade, like that, so that you can adjust for the width of your cut, and the side guides. The further apart you put the side guides, the greater the chance of this blade deflecting in your wood. You won't even see it until you're done cutting. But that blade, if you're cutting in some heavy wood and you're that far apart, that blade will deflect, or could deflect, when it's cutting your wood. So you always want to bring your guides down as far as you can and cut in that, because these guides are stabilizing that blade while you're cutting. Do not ever adjust the tension. Tension is always preset according to the width of the blade. And the other thing you don't ever want to do is readjust the skew of the fence. There is an adjustment for that, but we don't want you touching that because that's already been aligned for the drift, and we don't want you realigning it for whatever reason. If you're going to resaw something that is not straight, it's on an angle, then you've got to get the fence out of the way, and you have to freehand that particular piece that you want to resaw on an angle. We had one the other day like that. You want to feed the wood through the saw grain long. In other words, you want to feed it grain long so that the blade can cross cut. The grain of the wood is like this. The blade is at 90 degrees perpendicular to the table, so it's cutting cross cut as you feed your wood grain long through the saw. That's the way you want to feed it. If you have a piece and it will fit under here, and you say, yeah, I want to cut it the other way, okay, you're going to take a chance on this blade getting in between some of the softer parts of the grain, and it may tend to start to wander. So you always want to cut cross cut, and in order to cut cross cut, you feed grain long. There are only two methods of resawing. One method is what we just described, where you put your piece of wood up against the fence and you set your stop and you push it through the saw against the fence. The other method is using a pivot point, which is a lot more difficult. The pivot point is affixed to the table, and then as you go through, you draw a line on your piece of wood like that. Then you follow the pivot point, you follow the line, and the pivot point allows you to keep moving the wood back and forth so that you can stay in line. It's only two methods there are to resawing. Here in the shop, we've lined up the fence so that you can use the fence. All you got to do is bring the fence up here, put your workpiece against the fence and shove it just through the saw like you would a table saw. The wood should be pre-sawn on some other saw down to about the size of your project. If your project calls for wood pieces this size, don't rip a board this size and then try to cut these small pieces out of the long board, because you're going to be in the saw too long with these long pieces. The saw is going to get hot. You're going to have more gum buildup on the blade. You have to clean it more, and the blade won't last as long. So we want the blade to last as long as possible, stay as sharp as possible, and still get the job done. When you're resawing, you want to think small. Always think small when you're resawing. You'll also have better results if you plane one side of your wood and then joint one edge so that you can go against your fence at a perfect 90 degrees, and your end piece will be a lot better off for you. So always try, if you can, to get in the habit of planing one side, joining one edge, and run it through the saw like that. Now, the most important rule, the rate of feed. The rate of feed is how hard you push and how fast you push your wood through the saw. You've got to let the saw blade do its job. You've got to let it keep the wood, the kerf clean, and you'll be, after you resaw a couple pieces, you'll be able to feel it. You'll know exactly when the saw blade is working and when you can push a little harder or a little faster. A lot depends on the type of wood you're cutting. A lot depends on the condition that the blade is in. So you always want the blade to do its job, push your wood through smoothly and slowly. If you stop for any reason, so when you start up smoothly. never jerk your wood into the blade. Because if you jerk your wood into the blade, those coarse teeth can become embedded into the wood, and you have all this saw blade coming down and nothing coming through here because it's stuck, and you're going to break the blade. We've already had that happen once. So whenever you work your piece, always work it slowly and smoothly. When you stop, start out again smoothly, and you'll be fine. The bandsaw is a lot different than the table saw in this respect. As you're pressing your wood, cutting your wood through the saw, and you get down to the end, you have two options. One is you can push it through at the end with a push stick, even push your push stick into the blade. You can do it that way. Or on a bandsaw, you can, when you get down to about 2 inches, just come around to the other side of the saw and then pull your workpiece through the saw for the last 2 inches. This keeps your hand away from the blade and getting it too close and having a slip and maybe getting cut. Those blades are very, very sharp, and they will do some damage to your fingers or your hand. Okay. The other thing is, if you have multiple boards to cut and you finished cutting one board, okay, what you want to do is get in the habit, when your cut is finished, of stopping the saw with the foot pedal. Hold it down. It'll do two things. It'll stop the blade, and it'll also turn off this switch down here. Okay? It will not re-engage this switch. This switch will stay in the on position, so that when you go to cut your next board, the only thing you need to do is start it up here. You don't have to pull this again. You cut your next board. When it's done, press the foot pedal, the blade will stop, this will turn back, and then you're ready for your next board. That's perfectly acceptable and a good way to stop the saw, because as you press down, you'll get to feel it. It'll stop the blade pretty quick. Or in case of emergency, this is a good way to stop the saw. The carbide blade that we're going to put on the saw when it comes in has a value of about $250. This saw is going to continue to be a lockout saw, which means that the manager, you're going to have to sign out for it. We have a special sign out sheet that we're using where you fill it out. You put on that sheet that makes it different from the other sign out sheet is that we want the species of wood that you're cutting, so that we can maybe track the wood and see what kinds of wood maybe are causing damage to the blade or causing the blade to become dull quicker or whatever. So we want you to put the species that you're cutting and on the sign out sheet. Okay. The value of the steel blade, like this one, is only 50 bucks. So whenever you're done sawing, make sure you get the manager to sign off. He's going to look at the blade, he's going to look at it and see if it needs cleaned. If it needs cleaned, he's going to say, I think you better clean it. Like today, I would, if someone just finished sawing here and I was the manager, I'd say, no, you got to clean that. That's starting a build up there. And before you leave, clean the blade and let me look at it again. The way to clean the blade is we're going to provide you with some brass brushes with a long handle, and what you'll do is you'll crank the guides up as far as they'll go. I always start at the weld. Okay. Now I lost it. Make sure whenever you're touching the blade that the saw is unplugged. Bring the blade around till you get to the weld. Right there, see it? That's the weld. And then just clean it like this with the brush. How hard you're going to have to brush it depends on how much buildup is on there. If it's just a light buildup like we have on there now, it's not going to take much. Let me get to a part that hasn't been cleaned. Right there, you see. You just go like that lightly. It's cleaning. If you're on a small angle here, what you're doing is you're cleaning the edge and you're also cleaning the gullets. Okay? So you want to go all the way around the blade till you come to the weld again, and then you know that you've cleaned the whole blade. You always want to make sure that you clean both sides, and you want to go with the teeth. Don't ever try to go against the teeth. Always go with the teeth and clean both sides of the blade. Like that. This is the new sign-out sheet. Okay? You notice in red it says, user must clean the blade after each use. Just have the manager look at it. If it's not real clean, if you just cut something like this and that's all you cut, you're not going to have hardly anything, if anything, on the blade at all. So the blade should be fairly clean. But if you cut a lot and you've got a buildup on there, the manager should say to you, you've got to clean the blade. Don't leave your mess for somebody else. We got to clean up after ourselves. Okay. Like this. Featherboard handy. We're going to make a cut. I'm going to drop the guides down just above the wood. And because this piece is not real long, where it's not going to be sticking out here real far to grab, I'm going to push it all the way through with the push stick. Safety glasses on, got my sleeves up above my elbows. Put your push stick on if you have enough wood so that it's like this. This part of the push stick is keeping your board back against the fence. This part of your push stick is actually helping to push it through. When you get to the very end, you can slow down a little bit so you don't pop it into your push stick into the blade. Just slow down, let it finish the cut. Then press the pedal down, it'll stop the saw, and it'll turn the switch off. So there you have it. A nice resaw job. See, these two pieces were stuck together, and I used that as my guide so you can see we just cut them apart by doing it on the bandsaw. When you're done using the double feather board for the bandsaw, keep it with the bandsaw. Don't put it somewhere on the table or under a saw or something, so that some people try to use it on the table saws or the joiner, it's going the wrong way. So when you're done using the feather board for the bandsaw, just put it up here like this, turn one of these magnets, and that'll keep it there in that position. So that's all there is to it. Thank you for coming, and enjoy your resawing. But before I go, I want to go over here. Point the camera over here. See this pile of feather boards? These feather boards can no longer be used because they're damaged. And these feather boards are very, very expensive. when not only that, but when this many feather boards are out of service, there's people that don't have any feather board to use. So you see what's happening here. It just keeps going round and round, and it won't grab. And this happens when you turn too hard. People try to think it needs to be turned down to tighten. You just need to turn it delicately to the stop, and that's all you need to keep the feather board from moving. This feather board is ruined now because it keeps going round and round and round and doesn't stick anywhere. So I say that because we have so many here recently that are damaged. So always be conscious of how far you turn the knob when you use feather boards.